service,
love,
abundance,
significance,
hope,
gratitude,
freedom,
wisdom,
faith,
security,
peace,
discipline,
kindness,
truth.
Well, good Monday morning, beautiful person. You are listening to Things I Learned on Sunday, a recalling of insights harvested through conversation, observation, and the example of others. Now, the purpose of this podcast is that you share in the powerful impact of these insights along with me while you begin your day, and hopefully nourish your soul to start your week off right. Welcome. So Jolie and I, this weekend, we got the opportunity to go to Dogwood Canyon. And if you've never been to Dogwood Canyon before, the best way I can describe it, it is like a beautiful, privately owned, small state park. It's not cheap. It's like $20 a person to get in. But if you like running, or if you like riding a bike, or if you like going on walks in nature, this is probably the most bang for your buck for 7 miles of beautiful nature that you're ever going to find anywhere. Everywhere you look, there is either some kind of waterfall or some type of dam overflow. It's incredibly well manicured, and obviously the landscape has been formed to create this beautiful setting. So it's like 3.5 miles to the end and then back, and it's absolutely beautiful. So much so that I actually created a separate video, sort of like a home video of Jolie and mine, of this trip. And because I wanted to show just how much beauty there was, I recorded it in order from beginning to end. So I've put the link to that video in the description. And if you'd like to watch a video just about a relaxing bike ride through nature with like a calming soundtrack, you can click the link to that video in the description below this video. But while we were on that trip, there was a point where we're riding along and I am getting video with a gimbal, with my camera on a gimbal, with Jolie riding in front of me, and she sees a snake swimming through the water to her left. And she says to me, "Hey, look, there's a snake." And so I've got the camera on her, but I immediately look over to my left, not realizing she has come to a full stop directly in front of me. And so I'm looking, and my eyesight is not as good as hers, so I'm having trouble seeing it, and I look back to say where, and I'm afoot riding at regular speed from her bike. So I slam on the brakes, lean forward, and I almost lose my gimbal and my phone and crash the bike. And I actually have that at the very end of this video. It's like a short clip at the very end of the video. But it made me think of one of my favorite verses in Scripture. It actually made me think of the verse directly after that verse. My favorite verse is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. And that verse says, "Therefore," and it's referring back to Hebrews chapter 11. Anytime you see "therefore," it's always referring back to something previously. So Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses," and Hebrews chapter 11, the previous verse, is sometimes called the Hall of Fame or the Hall of Faith. And so these are people who lived incredibly faithful lives to God that we know about through Scripture. And so then Hebrews chapter 12 picks up where that leaves off, talking about these men of faith. So Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race that's marked out for us." And the part that almost crashing on my bike in front of Jolie made me think of was Hebrews chapter 12 verse 2 that then says, "Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith." Because Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 is likening, it's a metaphor for the Christian walk through life. It's a metaphor for moving towards Christ with running a race. And Hebrews chapter 12 verse 2 expands on how to do that we need to focus our eyes on Jesus as if he is at the finish line of the race. And I think this is where I have gotten tripped up in life, and I hope others can relate to this as well. Whenever I'm at church on Sunday, I'm focusing my eyes on Jesus. Whenever I am preparing a lesson for the college students, I'm focusing my eyes on Jesus. When I'm at church on Wednesday nights, I'm focusing my eyes on Jesus. But in my everyday dealings, I don't focus on Jesus as much, or there are times when I don't really focus on him at all. I'm not thinking of him in a daily dealing, or I'm not thinking of him in some kind of a decision that I am making. And metaphorically, that is like taking my eyes off of Jesus to deal with whatever this daily dealing is. And I think that is so much like the bike ride, this beautiful bike ride that Jolie and I went on. It was a beautiful day. The road was smooth. There were no problems. I'd been filming for a while. Everything was good. And so I look off of the road. I look off of the path I'm on. And whenever I look back, I am about to crash. And I feel like this is so much like life, that whenever we don't fix our eyes on Jesus, like Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2 says, in our everyday dealings, whenever we're just Sunday Christians, and then we kind of leave it at the door, like we don't keep Jesus top of mind, this is when, in our everyday dealings, we look off to the side, and Satan trips us up. We crash because we're not focusing our eyes on Jesus in this journey through life. So, the first point that I want to make is I need to fix my eyes on Jesus in my everyday dealings so Satan doesn't trip me up. I need to fix my eyes on Jesus not only when I'm in church and not only when I'm studying about him, but in my everyday dealings. Because if I am not focusing on him, if I look at something over here and I'm not focusing on what my journey should be, that's when Satan can slip in and make me crash. The second thing that I learned, and this I learned on Sunday during class, we were on chapter maybe 9 of the book Loosening Your Grip, which I've talked about quite a bit on here. And it came from a question I asked the students. The title of this chapter was Making Jesus Your Money Master. And the question that I asked was, what's a few reasons it might be a challenge to give at this point in your life? So what are a few reasons it might be a challenge to give financially at this point in your life? And again, I'm talking to college age students. And so I took their answers and I wrote them on the whiteboard. If you haven't figured this out already, or if you haven't listened to this podcast, this college group has no problem being open and authentic and discussing and contributing to discussion in order to be an encouragement to their brothers and sisters. So I always get amazing content from them. And so I wrote these things on the whiteboard that they were saying, and here's a few of the things that they said. Okay, so what's a few reasons it might be a challenge to give at this point in your life? Number one, it's just hard to get the money. Like, you might not have much money. Number two, lack of experience in handling money. So maybe either you spend it on something else, maybe you don't have any left, lack of experience in handling money. The third thing that was said was just forgetting. Like just forgetting to have money whenever you get to the church building, to have some cash, just forgetting. Number four, it not being in your budget. So not having enough money at the end of the month, or you just don't plan to give whenever you're that age. Number six, it's a huge sacrifice for some. Again, because you don't have that much money at that stage in your life, so it means more to you than it means to the next person. And then the sixth thing, sixth thing, selfishness. Just not wanting to give it up. So these are the kinds of answers that I get to questions that are very authentic from my college students. I want you to keep these answers in mind as we go through this thing I remembered. Hard to get the money, lack of experience in handling money, just forgetting, it not being in your budget. It's a huge sacrifice for some, and selfishness, not wanting to give it up. So in class, we talked about Luke chapter 8 and how Jesus was traveling from one village or town to another, and he was proclaiming the good news. He had the 12 apostles with him. Luke, the author, makes it a point to say in verse 3 of this text that these women were helping to support them, Jesus and the apostles, out of their own means, meaning that they were supporting Jesus and the apostles financially. Now, what I find even more interesting about this scripture is that if you look back to verse 2, it says, some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases, these were the ones that were with them. And it specifically mentions Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. And then it mentions the other 2 women. What I find fascinating about this is it explains that these women had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. And then in verse 3, it says these were the women who were helping to support Jesus and his apostles financially out of their own means. And I think there is not a coincidence that these 2 things were mentioned close together. And so we talked about that in class. You know, these women felt like they owed a debt of gratitude to Jesus. And so there was a reciprocity. They wanted to give back because they had been given to. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. And so the point that the author makes along with this scripture is that giving presupposes an understanding of grace. That these women understood what Christ had done for them, and because they had understood that they wanted to give out of their own means. So then, if we go to Luke chapter 7, if we go back to the previous chapter, you really get an idea of a theme growing between both of these chapters. See, earlier in Luke chapter 7, from what we're going to read, you see a Pharisee, Simon, who has invited Jesus to eat at the dinner table with him. And so Jesus goes to his house. But there's a problem, at least in the Pharisees' eyes. There is a woman who is known as a sinner, Scripture says. She's known for living a sinful life. She comes to the house, and she is indebted to Jesus. So she has an alabaster jar of perfume, and if you don't know what alabaster is, it is a mineral that's sort of a translucent white. It looks sort of like ivory, but it's like a rock, and then it has some translucence to it. It's very beautiful. And so she has an alabaster jar of perfume, which to fashion a jar for perfume out of alabaster back then would have been incredibly expensive. It would be expensive today, but much more expensive then. And so this woman who is known as a sinner, who does not have the same station as the Pharisee, probably does not have the same wealth as the Pharisee, is pouring this perfume on his feet and basically is washing his feet and wiping them with her tears and hair. So this brings us to Luke chapter 7, verse 39. The Pharisee has a problem with this. And verse 39 says, "When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, 'If this man were a prophet, he'd know who's touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she's a sinner.'" So Jesus, knowing that this is what the Pharisee is thinking, because he said it to himself. So Jesus answers the Pharisee as if he had actually said the question to Jesus or said the statement to Jesus. And he says, "Simon, I have to tell you something, or I have something to tell you." Simon says, "Tell me, teacher." Jesus said, "Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other owed 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more?" So Christ wanted to correct the improper thinking of this man, and the Pharisee goes on to say, well, probably the one who's going to love him more is going to be the one who forgave the larger debt. So he immediately understood the story that Jesus was trying to tell, that the woman who was known for living a sinful life, she was the one who was more indebted to Jesus because she had more to be forgiven. And so there were a couple of questions that I asked during replay on Sunday night at our house. The first one was, what would have to happen in your life for you to feel the same as the sinful woman, for you to feel the same kind of indebtedness as the sinful woman? And Hannah said, when you grow up with an understanding of Christ, it's harder to have great indebtedness because it's so familiar, like you've always known it. And I mentioned the law of familiarity last week without giving a description of what that is. So the law of familiarity states that anything that is very familiar to us, anything that we have known for the long time, has the propensity to be devalued. So anything that becomes familiar can lose value in our eyes if we're not careful. That happens in marriages. That happens in families. That happens with jobs or with things that we've had for a long time. If we're not careful, we will devalue those things. And so what Hannah was saying is that when you grow up with an understanding of Christ, it's harder to have great indebtedness. And I can say this is very true for me from my perspective, that growing up in the church and hearing from the time I was able to start comprehending what Christ did for me, I have seen those who have come to Christ later in life and who understand the big picture after they're an adult and how much they feel the grace, and because of that grace, how indebted they feel. And I'm going to be very honest, I grew up poor. In this lessons on giving financially, they're one of my greatest weaknesses and one of my greatest challenges. Because of the fact that I grew up poor, like we were never not going to have food to eat. That's not the way that I grew up, and I'm very thankful for that. I ate a lot of bologna sandwiches growing up, and I believe I had the mentality of a poor person and a feeling of scarcity as a kid. So that's what I mean when I say I grew up poor. And whenever you grow up poor, it's very hard to let go of money whenever you have it. Maybe there are some of you out there that grew up poor that know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, it's hard to let it go and know that everything is going to be okay, that there's going to be money later. And so then you take what Hannah said, that when you grow up with an understanding of Christ, it's harder to have great indebtedness because it's so familiar, like you've always known it. I think for me, this is one of the things I learned on Sunday because it made two pieces of this really clear for me. Number one, I've grown up with God's grace in my life, and many times it has become too familiar for me. And then number two, I grew up poor, and it's been very hard to let go, just like loosening your grip, the title of the book, letting go and living in true security. I've had trouble giving that over to God and trusting in God rather than trusting in that money that I have. And so this is a real challenge for me, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say that it's a real weakness of mine. And it's something that I am working on. I'm challenging myself to try to let go and understand God's grace better and to give it over to Him, to give all areas of my life over to Him. Tanner made the point that if you're foreclosed on, it doesn't matter if you owe less than the next guy and you're both foreclosed on, you're still both foreclosed on. And I thought that was such a great example. He was saying that he doesn't feel like he's really ever been really wild or lived that much of a sinful life compared to others around him. And again, something else that I really kind of relate to. I sin every day, but I don't have those dramatic big sins that I think sometimes we try to weigh sin, like that some sins are worse than others. And so because of that, I sometimes think I'm okay, like I'm good. Thus, I don't feel as indebted to God like the woman who lived a sinful life from Luke. So I think because of that, I forget that, hey, if you don't have the money to pay for the home you're going to be foreclosed on, it doesn't matter if it's less money than the next guy. And I thought that was such a good analogy. So here's the thing that I really learned, if I want to codify this, on Sunday from class and from my college students when they were at our house Sunday night. There is a correlation between the depth of my understanding of God's grace afforded me and my ability to give financially. So there's a correlation between the depth of my understanding of how much of a sinner I am, which also shows me how much grace God is affording me, because grace means you are giving something that you do not deserve. And the better that I understand God's grace afforded me, there's a correlation. That's going to help me to have more ability to give. And that's something that I definitely need to be working on and moving towards. So there's a correlation between the depth of my understanding of God's grace afforded me and my ability to give financially. And the third thing that I learned on Sunday comes from our discussion over the sermon Sunday morning, also at replay at our house on Sunday night. The scriptures, Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 8, "They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit." So there's a couple of things about this scripture that I want to mention. Number one, it's talking about a tree planted by the water, which clearly is a metaphor for the living water for a relationship with God. And then it says it does not fear when heat comes. It talks about a year of drought. These are both ideas, number one, that challenges are going to come into our lives, and also that there are different seasons of life. Sometimes things are better than others, and as Ecclesiastes says, there's a season for everything. So it has no worries in a year of drought. Its leaves are always green, and it never fails to bear fruit. So because that they're living close to Christ, they're not afraid and they don't worry when challenges occur, when there's lots of pressure, and they don't worry when they're in a difficult season, a difficult time of life. And they never, the very last part of verse 8 says, they never fail to bear fruit. So even when these things are going on, they don't worry and they bear fruit. So I asked a very simple question: how might your life be different if you never, ever worried? And here were some of the answers. Hannah's getting a lot of airtime in this episode. Good job, Hannah. If I didn't worry, I would be a chatterbox, meaning I wouldn't worry about what people thought, and I would be lighter, and I would just be talking all the time. Sam said, I would have a smile on my face more often for sure if I never ever worried. And then Sarissa said, I wouldn't budget as much. Like, I would let go a little bit and not live so much in fear and be budgeting all the time. It would be more healthy. And so putting all of these things together, it made me sad, because I see something that worry does very, very, very specifically. I mean, we know we're not as healthy whenever we worry, but piecing all of these together, it really shows how worrying dims our light. Like, if you weren't worried, you would talk a lot more. And you wouldn't think so much about what other people think. You wouldn't have such a burden of a filter on you. You would smile more. Like, you would surely have a smile on your face a lot more often, because the burden that comes with worry, it affects you internally, and that shows up on your face. And you wouldn't spend as much time focusing on things in your own life or worrying about yourself. So you would be able to be more present for others. So the scripture talks about the fact that it doesn't matter what season it is. It doesn't matter what pressures you have going on in life. You're not going to worry. It specifically uses the word worry, and it uses the word fear. But then also you're going to be able to bear fruit. Why are you going to be able to do these things? Because you're not as worried about what other people think, because you're just genuinely happier and people are attracted to that, and because you're altruistic and looking towards others. So this is the third thing that I learned on Sunday. The less I worry, the more brightly my light is going to shine for others. So I have a duty to be consciously aware of my worry, to look into the mirror of my soul and be working on moving towards God, giving things over to Him to worry less. Because when I worry less, the more brightly my light is going to shine. And that is going to help me, as Jeremiah says, to bear fruit and to take care of others. So the less I worry, the more brightly my light is going to shine for others. That is it. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you haven't already, subscribe and tickle the little notification bell to be notified of spiritually nourishing content appearing regularly. Consider commenting so we, you and I, can grow this community outside these 4 digital walls. Make a great day today. Make a great week by serving and allowing your bright light to be seen all week. And as the good book says, they will know we are Christians by our love. Until next time.